200 family members packed into a banquet room on a Navy base in San Diego last Thursday night. They were there to confront the acting Secretary of the Navy. And by the time it was over, spouses were in tears. A room full of people were applauding a woman who said she was ashamed of what her husband was being asked to do, and the Navy's second highest civilian official had no good answer for the one question everyone in that room actually needed answered. When is my family member coming home? This is the story of the USS Abraham Lincoln, a 90,000-ton nuclear supercarrier, 5,000 sailors and Marines, and a deployment that has now stretched so long it has broken a record almost nobody wanted broken. Here's where it starts. Late November of last year, the Lincoln pulls out of Naval Base San Diego. Nothing dramatic. A carrier heading out on a deployment that was supposed to run about 7 months with a Pacific-facing mission plan. It makes one brief stop at Guam in mid-December. And then, everything changes. Because at the end of February, the United States opens a military campaign against Iran. Operation Epic Fury, the Pentagon calls it, and the Lincoln, instead of coming home on schedule, gets redirected into the fight. A routine deployment becomes an open-ended one. Now fast forward to this month. As of last Friday, the Abraham Lincoln has been deployed for 259 days. 208 of those days were spent continuously at sea without a single port call before the ship finally pulled into Oman on July 7th. That is a modern-day record for continuous time underway for a U.S. carrier. Sailors on board have now been in a combat zone without solid ground under their feet, longer than almost any crew in the history of the modern Navy. And the ship still doesn't have a date to come home. That's the backdrop for what happened Thursday night. 2 meetings, actually. One in person at a place called the Island Club on Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. About 200 relatives of Lincoln sailors and Marines showed up. And a second meeting held virtually that same night for families who couldn't be there, representing some share of the roughly 5,000 people serving on that ship. In the room was Hung Chau, the acting Secretary of the Navy. He took over the Navy's top civilian post back in April after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth removed the previous secretary, John Phelan, following a string of clashes between the two men. Also in the room, senior Navy commanders, there to answer for the conditions their own sailors were describing to their families back home. And what did families say they were hearing? Moldy showers, toilets that stopped working for extended stretches in parts of the ship, food and mail backlogs because the supply routes running through Bahrain, the 5th Fleet's regional hub, have been disrupted by the wider war, water quality concerns. And running underneath almost every other complaint, mounting worry about the mental health of sailors who have now been at sea in a combat zone for the better part of a year. One parent told the room her daughter believes she is never coming home, that she thinks she's going to die on that ship. Another family member, whose husband serves aboard the Lincoln, said publicly that she struggled to feel proud of his service given what she understood the mission to involve. According to 2 people who were in the room and spoke afterward to the outlet MS Now, that comment drew applause. Now, to be fair to the Navy leadership in that room, they didn't simply deny it all. According to recordings of the virtual meeting reviewed by MS Now, Navy officials acknowledged the toilet problems. They acknowledged they're working on the shower situation. And they acknowledged there's a real backlog getting food and mail from Bahrain out to the ship directly because of wartime disruption to the supply chain. What they could not do, and this is really the heart of the anger in that room, is tell anyone when the Lincoln is coming home. Cow told families the Navy is preparing another carrier, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, to relieve the Lincoln. But he said he couldn't give a date, citing operational security. For families who've already watched a 7-month deployment stretch past 8 months, past the 200-day mark, with no end in sight, that answer landed about as well as you'd expect. One spouse, describing a baby born during her husband's deployment, said he's had 0 time with his own daughter. She's not alone. Multiple families at that meeting described children born, and in some cases relatives who died, while their sailor was still out at sea with no way to get home for any of it. Now here's a detail that matters, because it's easy to miss just how unusual this year has been for the Navy's carrier fleet. The Lincoln isn't even the record holder anymore for the longest carrier deployment since Vietnam. That distinction belongs to a different ship entirely, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest and largest carrier, which finished a deployment of 326 days back in May, 11 months at sea, the longest deployment for any American aircraft carrier since the war in Vietnam. And the Ford's deployment had its own crisis. In March, while operating in the Red Sea in support of that same Iran campaign, a fire broke out in the ship's laundry facility. The Navy said at the time it wasn't combat-related, an electrical fault most likely, in equipment that was being run harder than it was built to handle. But it turned out to be far more serious than first reported. According to the New York Times, and later confirmed by the Washington Post, the fire spread through ventilation ducts and swept through berthing spaces used by more than 600 crew members, about 1 in every 8 people on board. It took more than 30 hours to fully extinguish. Some sailors slept on floors and tables while damage was assessed. The Navy had to pull nearly 1,000 mattresses off a sister ship still under construction in Virginia and fly them out to the Ford, along with roughly 2,000 replacement clothing items. Because most of the ship's laundry capability was wiped out, the carrier had to divert to Suda Bay, Crete, for more than a week of repairs. According to the Navy's top officer, the fire even halted flight operations for 2 days, the first public admission that it had a real impact on the mission itself. 2 ships, 2 records, both broken inside the same few months in the same war. There's a third carrier in this story too, the USS George H.W. Bush, which deployed from Norfolk at the end of March to join the fight. And the Bush's journey to the Middle East tells you something on its own about how dangerous the waters around this conflict have become. Rather than take the normal route East Coast carriers use, through the Strait of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and into the Red Sea, the Bush and its escort ships deliberately sailed the long way. Down the Atlantic, around the southern tip of Africa, past Namibia, and back up into the Arabian Sea. Defense officials confirmed to USNI News that the detour was designed specifically to avoid the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, where Houthi forces backed by Iran have repeatedly targeted commercial and military shipping with missiles and drones. No U.S. carrier had transited those waters since 2023. Whatever else that says about the state of this conflict, it's a striking fact on its own. American naval planners decided the safer path to a war zone was 6,000 extra miles around an entire continent. So that's the operational picture. 3 carriers, 3 record-setting or near-record deployments, all tied to the same open-ended war. Now, what has the Navy's civilian leadership actually said in public while families were living through all of this? On August 5th, or the day before that San Diego meeting, Acting Secretary Cao issued a fleet-wide memo. Its subject line, Warrior Ethos. In it, Cao called for what he described as an urgent, department-wide reevaluation of basic military standards, appearance, and professionalism. He wrote that a squared-away sailor displays confidence, focus, and precision, and that physical appearance and personal comportment are where military culture starts. He also addressed how sailors and Marines conduct themselves on social media, writing that their words reflect not just on them individually, but on the entire department. To some in the Navy's own commentary circles, that memo was a straightforward call to restore discipline and readiness. To military families who just spent the same week describing broken plumbing, mold, and food shortages to Navy leadership directly, the timing struck a very different chord. A memo about grooming standards and bearing landing in inboxes the same week their loved ones were describing conditions they said were affecting their mental health. It's also not the first time this year that reports about shipboard conditions and the Pentagon's response to them have collided. Back in April, photos of near-empty meal trays aboard the Lincoln and the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli circulated online, and Secretary Hegseth dismissed the coverage at the time as fake news. Families and sailors involved in the more recent reporting say the same basic complaints, thin food supply shortages, have simply continued. Separately, Hegseth has taken heat this summer for a different kind of public messaging. Responding to complaints about troop morale, he's repeatedly promoted low military flyovers over civilian beaches as a way to boost public spirit, posting on social media in July that, quote, "The flyovers will continue until morale improves." It's a comment that's drawn plenty of both mockery and support online, and it sits, whether intentionally or not, in uncomfortable proximity to a summer defined by sailors' families publicly describing a genuine morale crisis at sea. There is a political dimension to this story too, and it's worth being straightforward about where that stands. Congressmember Sarah Jacobs, a Democrat who represents San Diego, the Lincoln's home port, has said she's deeply concerned about the crew's exhaustion and mental health, warning that extended, high-stress deployments carry historically elevated risk of suicide among service members. She has called on the administration to bring the war to a close and bring sailors home. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia has made similar comments regarding the Ford's deployment, saying crews should be home with their families rather than kept at sea for the duration of an open-ended conflict. Those are the positions of individual Democratic lawmakers. Republican officials in the Trump administration, including Secretary Hegseth and Secretary Cao, have defended both the operational necessity of the deployments and the steps the Navy says it's taking to address the specific complaints raised. What isn't in dispute, because it's been separately confirmed on the record by military and defense officials themselves, is the plain operational math. The Navy does not currently have enough carriers to sustain this level of commitment in the Middle East without pushing individual ships and crews past historical limits. Vice Chief of Naval Operations Admiral James Kilby told lawmakers earlier this year he expected the Ford's deployment to stretch toward 11 months specifically because there wasn't another carrier ready to take its place. The same dynamic is now playing out with the Lincoln. Cao's own answer to families in San Diego, that the Roosevelt is being prepared, but he can't say when it will actually arrive, is in effect an admission of that same underlying strain. So where does that leave the roughly 5,000 people currently serving aboard the Abraham Lincoln somewhere in the Arabian Sea, more than 250 days into a deployment that was supposed to last 200? It leaves them exactly where their families described it Thursday night, waiting, no fixed return date. A war that's now stretching into its sixth month with no clear resolution in public view. A Navy leadership that has acknowledged real problems with plumbing, showers, food, and mail, while offering no firm timeline for when any of it, including the deployment itself, actually ends. For the parents, spouses, and children back home, that uncertainty is the story. Not a single villain, not a single fix, just an open question that 200 people flew or drove to a San Diego banquet hall to ask directly, and that nobody in the room that night was able to answer.